Thank you, Rosamunde. Thank you, Anders. Thank you, all the conveners, for organizing this lovely conference, symposium, and for the opportunity to share some of this ongoing research with so many brilliant scholars of surveillance. So the talk should last around 45 minutes, and then I'm looking forward to hearing your questions and comments. Okay, so I will just dive straight in. Many people come and tell me, I don't have anything to hide. It is not about hiding. It is about feeling the freedom and the safety to develop your personality, to develop your interests. I will never know whether I like this piece of music or not before I listen to it. I guess you could compare it to time. You could say a person who is a workaholic and super busy, has 2 kids and a family, they chose this kind of life. They chose their work environment to have children and so on. So all of their time is filled up with these kinds of activities. Where is the harm in that? But I would argue that this person needs some me time in order to understand how they are connected to all of these decisions, to all of these environments, to all these relationships, to understand how they themselves feel, what they want in life. And for this possibility, I believe this is the basis of democracy, of any free-thinking, feeling, breathing society. We need these kinds of spaces in terms of time, in terms of information, data, surveillance. In this extract from an interview with a privacy activist in Berlin, total surveillance is compared with a total absence of time. Non-surveillance is dissociated from its prevailing connection with secrecy and instead presented as a temporal space that allows for growth and change, both for the individual and for a democratic society. In this lecture, I'd like to explore this connection between surveillance and temporality from the perspective of privacy activists in Germany, placing them in conversation with some of the salient features of surveillance technologies as they have been understood by scholars. So this research is based on around 15 months of ethnographic fieldwork in Germany between June 2019 and December 22, with a number of associations, groups, and concerned citizens that are sometimes known collectively as Netzpolitik. And I had fieldwork engagements with all of these associations, events, to some degree or another. I used a mixture of formal and informal interviews, participation at in-person online events, and archival research in district courts. And the aim of the research was broadly to address the question of why, over the past 20 or so years, Germany, and particularly Berlin, has been the main, possibly the foremost site of coordinated and to some degree effective resistance to the exponential growth of digital surveillance over this period. So what I present today is part of an ongoing effort to understand emic conceptions in Netzpolitik of privacy and data protection, and what exactly it is about surveillance as they understand it that they so strongly object to. An agreed definition of privacy is not essential for participating in the life of German privacy activism. However, although their definitions are offered as personal orientations, they do collect around certain themes, metaphors, and signifiers. Privacy is often understood as a space that allows a transition from one state to another, particularly in the form of intellectual development. This is partly afforded by the word privacy, in German, Privatsphäre, which contains a spatial orientation in its inclusion of the concept of a sphere. For example, you need spaces to be by yourself without feeling forced by public life. It's also a question of how you inform yourself online. What sites do I click on? How do I form my own opinions? In this process of development, failing and being imperfect may be part of the process. For another, privacy is the possibility of being oneself without absolutely hitting the nail on the head with every word in a sentence. Metaphors of the organic world, more specifically of plants and vegetation, may be used. And these are both visual representations of privacy taken from the field site. Privacy is described as an inner garden or as the soil on which anything can grow. As in the extract with which I began, presenting privacy as a site of growth allows for a discursive slippage between interior intellectual development and spaces for the development of democratic society. Sometimes the moral emphasis is not on privacy itself, but on privacy as a means towards digital or informational self-determination. As one says, I want to know, I want everyone to know, where is the data about me? Who has it? What are they doing with it? And how can I prevent people from doing something with it that I don't want them to? For one feminist activist, a self-determined sphere is preferable to the concept of a private sphere because of the historical ways in which the latter lent legitimacy to the enclosure of women in domestic settings. In general, however, citing self-determination is a more or less explicit reference to a landmark ruling in Germany in 1983 by its Federal Constitutional Court, which guaranteed West German citizens the right to informational self-determination. The ruling came about as a legal response to new capacities of electronic technology for the storage, transmission, and processing of personal information. These opened up new possibilities for the construction of an image of the personality, Persönlichkeitsbild, beyond the knowledge and control of the affected individual. Self-determination is the retention of some degree of agency over this image, what in the language of surveillance studies we might call a data double. The ruling was forged out of 2 articles of German basic law, which guaranteed general constitutional protection for the rights of the personality. The first is Article 1, that the value of each human being is inviolable. And the second is the first clause of Article 2, that every human being has the right to the free development, this word Entfaltung, of their personality. And when making the ruling, the justices described its reasoning in detail. This is part of their description. Whoever cannot with sufficient certainty oversee which information regarding them is known in specific areas of their social environment, and whoever is not able to some extent to estimate the knowledge of possible communication partners can be essentially limited in their freedom to plan or decide on the basis of their own self-determination. This reasoning, the protection of the personality, and by implication, democratic society, takes an explicitly future-oriented form. It is the individual's right to plan or decide. In other words, to act in the present upon the future that is being safeguarded. It's worth reflecting in more depth on the specific term that is used to indicate this future orientation, Entfaltung. Entfaltung can be translated as evolution or development. Yet its connotation is not exactly the same as the way these latter terms were, and indeed still are, used as the temporal backbone of modernity in the Anglophone world. One that in the most general terms invokes time as a line and change as different coordinates upon it. Entfaltung also means blooming or blossoming and can be used with direct reference to plant life, indicating an internal dynamic that is allowed through environmental circumstances to realize itself, to become larger. Entfaltung also means to expand. As we turn towards some of the historical instantiations of surveillance and the way it has been theorized, I'd like to hold on to some of these notions of non-monitoring as creating a space in which change can occur, but in which the modality of change is not mechanical, but organic, a principle of growth and becoming larger, the possibility of bearing flowers and fruit. The history of surveillance is entangled with historical attempts to restrict the physical movement of certain categories of person. The incarceration of those categorized as criminal is only the thick end of a much larger wedge that extends to many mobile forms of tracking and containing for social purposes. In the plantation economy of 17th to 19th century America, enslaved persons were tied to the territories of their owners through a variety of information technologies, amongst them the slave pass, a document with details of the bearer, the owner, and where they were permitted to travel. Even after abolition, the use of paper passes to tie labor to land and in other ways restrict the physical mobility of racialized actors is a common feature of the colonial world and its aftermath, as also studied by in Rosamunde's work on Belgium and the Congo. For example, the kipande system introduced during British colonial rule in Kenya in the 1920s makes this particularly apparent. All Kenyan males of working age were required to be registered by their local administration and at all times carry a document which recorded personal details, fingerprints, as well as a ledger noting successive places of employment. It was in theory not possible for the bearer to move into another place of employment before the previous employer had signed him off. And this image is a later instantiation of the Kipande registration system in which workers carry a pass book with movement permits. In the digital age, the association between certain kinds of surveillance and limitations on physical mobility continues through the carceral use of global positioning systems. In the United States criminal justice system, electronic supervision through digital shackles worn around the ankle are used as an alternative to, or in the aftermath of imprisonment, transmitting the bearer's locational data to relevant authorities in real time. When the border of zones of permitted movement are breached, alarms may be triggered, or the bearer even subjected to local electrical shock. GPS tracking is also increasingly used in the US to monitor and restrict the mobility of asylum seekers and other migrants. Carolina Sanchez-Bow estimates that 324,000 migrants are currently being electronically monitored in the US, either through digital shackles like this one here, or increasingly through the more humane system of facial recognition on location-tracked smartphones. In their ongoing campaign against the expansion of facial recognition in Germany, one activist group collected short interviews with leading privacy activists or advocates across the Germanophone world on why this campaign was important for them. Several expressed their opposition to the technology using the language of movement. Thomas Lohninger says, "I am against facial recognition in the public sphere because the one thing that is important in a free liberal democracy is that people can move around unobserved." While Marcus Beckedahl says, "I consider automated video recognition with biometric characteristics to be a great danger to our democracy because we can no longer move freely afterwards." The fixing of identity into a singular, essential, and unchanging form that facial recognition enables causes alarm in the German privacy world. As Ulrich Kelber, the widely revered Federal Commissioner for Data Protection and Freedom of Information, puts it, "You cannot change your face like you can change your password." This fear of being frozen, unable to move, unable to change, takes us to a critical aspect of the technologies discussed. Those forms of surveillance that have been used to restrict physical mobility have also necessarily entailed in different ways and to different degrees the fixing of identity. Modes of immobilizing bodies are at the same time modes of immobilizing the meaningful aspects of who a person is, and therefore the specific ways in which they become visible as subjects of surveillance to a given socio-political order. In the colonial era and its aftermath, identities were fixed along genealogical racial lines through forms of mass registration, such as the colonial census. As Simone Brown says, "Census enumeration is a means through which a state manages its residents by way of particular categories that fix individuals within a certain time and a particular space." This landmark ruling in the former West Germany to the right to informational self-determination, which has very important, enduring legal and social implications, both in Germany and also for the formation of GDPR, took place in the midst of large-scale protests in the former West Germany, as documented by Matthew Hanna, against plans to introduce a national census. It's now the moment to turn to Germany's own history of censuses and other modes of information collection, and the kinds of memory work that take place in the present in relation to surveillance by recalling selective aspects of this historical past. One of the first laws passed by the Nazi government after coming to power in 1933 were instructions to carry out a number of censuses of the population and its minorities. This form of mass information gathering was undertaken through the material medium of the punch card, developed by German-American engineer Hermann Hollerith and already used in several American censuses. The company, Dehomag, a subsidiary of IBM, developed a punch card for the New Reich with 60 columns on which 60 different demographic identifiers could be recorded. What made the punch card much faster as a means of collecting and sorting information was its capacity to make human characteristics machine readable and machine sortable. Along with the punch card, Hollerith developed a tabulating machine, such as this one here, to detect where the punches were on the card and to file them accordingly. When the Nazis undertook their second census in 1939, this technology had become even more efficient. These tabulating machines able to count up to 12,000 punch cards every hour. By 1939, the questions on the censuses had also shifted from an earlier emphasis on biological reproduction towards fine-grained racial, ethnic, and other forms of mass profiling, which then provided the informational basis for the Volkskartei, the national identity card. As Erwin Kunz, one of the developers of this so-called registry of the populace, put it in a letter to Hitler, one need only proceed with the knowledge that man is a versatile and self-directing being. The principle of organization should therefore not be the counting of something that can constantly change. Rather, it should be something that can always stay the same. The Volkskartei was a population scale endeavor to fix identity along certain categorical lines and to render these fixed identities machine readable. As Ali and Gotz argue in their influential book on the Nazi census, it was these registration cards, punch cards, and tabulating machines that provided the material infrastructure for the Holocaust. Many decades later, in successive social movements in the former West Germany, as well as after reunification, this historical association between machine readability and mortal threat has endured. One of the key symbols of the 1980s census boycott movement was the barcode. Barcodes appeared on posters, on walls, on bodies, and in photographs, indexing something antithetical to the human and inherently dangerous. In this central image, the mnemonic connection between machine readability and the Holocaust is made very clear. Yet the use of the barcode and other symbols of machine readability continues right through into 21st century German privacy movements. In 2018, over 5 million people signed a petition against upload filters. Upload filters being software that has the capacity to automatically detect and block certain kinds of content. This was the largest petition in EU history, which occurred alongside numerous street protests in a number of German cities. And the main motto of these protests was, "Wir sind keine Bots," we are not bots, enforcing ontological distinctions between human and machine actors online that are increasingly blurred in the digital age. When I describe my research on privacy activism in Germany to family, to friends, and to colleagues, one of the first things that sometimes comes to the interlocutor's mind is the Stasi. The Stasi is an abbreviation of Ministerium für Staatssicherheit, the former Ministry of State Security, which was the large-scale covert intelligence operation of the former German Democratic Republic. The story of the Stasi, in which East German citizens were invited or coerced to spy on one another and root out potential dissidents, is much more widely known, partly through the reach of films like The Lives of Others, than the punch cards produced by IBM. Therefore, particularly for those outside of Germany, the historical memory of the Stasi is frequently presumed to be the main causal factor for the comparative strength of privacy sensibility in Germany. And in 2018, Mark Zuckerberg was here in Paris in the very week that GDPR was coming into effect, and spoke at a tech conference, stating in his talk that it was because of the Stasi that German citizens were so unusually sensitive to data protection. This assumption can also be reinforced inside Germany. This is a display inside the newly reconstructed Humboldt Forum, which for those of you who haven't been there is a large world-facing exhibition center in the center of Berlin that was erected on the grounds of the old East German Palace of the Republic. And this is an actual surveillance monitor from the former building. And as the blurb says, these monitors were used inside and outside to keep it under close surveillance. Employees were checked, visitors observed, telephones tapped, and central areas monitored by cameras. And it then goes on to discuss the systematic spying on dissidents that took place in the GDR. Now, there are three things that I think are interesting about this assemblage as a form of memory work. The first is this continual global equation of surveillance in Germany with the GDR regime. The second, more tacit association, is that surveillance itself is being specifically equated here with a computer, with something electronic, when we know surveillance can take place through many forms of mediation that are not computational. But the third, I think, potentially most striking association is this unarticulated contradiction inscribed in the wider assemblage of the space between this display, which takes up a whole corridor of the Humboldt Forum, and the video surveillance cameras that are installed in the Humboldt Forum that look out over it. As a historical representation, this display is ever so slightly misleading. Of course, the GDR regime used cameras and computers, and the Stasi were highly experimental and willing to use new technologies for the purposes of covert surveillance. However, in the specific forms that surveillance took in the GDR, there was a greater emphasis on the human intelligence collected by their network of official and unofficial informers, who by the end of the regime constituted an estimated 173,000 people. By contrast, the far shorter Nazi regime was much more reliant on machine readability than human intelligence, and indeed in its own necropolitics of information gathering, the Nazis made a fetish of ways of knowing populations that were entirely statistical. In my conversations with privacy activists in Germany, an experiential or historical memory of the Stasi was not cited without prompting as a motivation for their political activities. When I raise the subject, this collective memory is acknowledged as significant, but is encompassed within larger political patterns in the region with regards to authoritarian surveillance. As one of my interlocutors put it rather grimly, we are the masters of surveillance. There are a number of key figures in German Netzpolitik who are born and raised in the GDR and cite these experiences as formational. However, the current constitution of German privacy activism is dominated by associations registered in the former West Germany and by people raised either after 1989 or in the former West, all of whom, among those I interviewed, took part in the 1980s census boycott. Post-East German identity is thus a minority position that is presented as biographical, rather than the deeper collective memory of fascism which unites the former East and West. An aspect of surveillance that has long been recognized by surveillance scholars and will be familiar to everyone here is function creep. Function creep is the phenomenon whereby a socio-technical system designed for one purpose or purposes starts to be used for another. Function creep is a theory of social change around technology, and to that extent it is a theory of temporality in which that temporality is creeping, so slow or so quiet as to be almost imperceptible. Gary Marks, in his work on undercover policing, introduced the specific concept of surveillance creep, saying, as powerful new surveillance tactics are developed, the range of their legitimate and illegitimate use is likely to spread. Where there is a way, there is often a will. There are numerous examples in the history of surveillance in which monitoring technologies designed for one potentially more benign purpose start to be used for another rather less benign. However, the social conditions within which surveillance creep occurs are not just the behaviors of those commanding a particular surveillance apparatus, but also to some extent those whom it implicates in its modes of information collection. Surveillance creep thrives in environments where there is an assumption of political stability and continuity. In other words, that whoever's hands the technology may be in, the ends of information gathering will stay the same. What is particularly striking about those who participate in Netzpolitik is this heightened sensitivity to the possibility of political change. The future is a term very present in this discursive sphere, not as a promise of technological optimism, but as potential threat. For example, Snowden says, freedom of opinion is also important for people who don't have an opinion. Maybe they will have one day. They go on. But that also means, of course, it's not just that I have something to hide now, but the question is, what will happen in the future? So if we already have all these instruments, what will happen if the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, comes to power? Who is then suddenly in the focus? Who is it then that will be surveyed? And then they already have all the data. So it wouldn't affect the majority at first. It won't affect me for the time being, but it would affect refugees, for example, who are the first to be targeted. And of course, I can always say that it will only affect other people. It won't affect me. So I have nothing to hide, but who knows if I will have something to hide in the future. These actors do not presume political stability. They acknowledge that political conditions in Germany are presently comparatively good, but do not presume that future political conditions will be the same as those of the present. And therefore, care must be taken right now, particularly with respect to data collection, to protect against political change in a malign direction. This is where the cultural and legal concept of self-determination comes in as a praxis around technology. And this can take any number of social or gestural forms. It can mean, for example, using particular platforms for communication that are encrypted or do not use algorithms to determine content, such as Mastodon, which is, of course, registered in Berlin. Or it could simply mean the quick gesture of acquiring verbal consent from subjects before a photograph is taken. It's important to, I think, observe that these privacy activists are not retreating from the world. They are not hiding, as my opening interlocutor put it, nor are they invested in anonymity as an end in itself, but are often engaged directly and even energetically in the German-speaking public sphere. And part of my project entails thinking further about what is this public alternative to infrastructures of surveillance, in which the opposite of surveillance is not withdrawal and retreat, but instead a remaking of the public sphere along a different set of lines. And in doing this, I find it productive to think with Simone Brown's concept of dark surveillance. Reworking Steve Mann's concept of surveillance, the surveillance that happens from below in order to confront the surveillance from above, Brown introduces the concept of dark surveillance as a way to explore the generative possibilities of rendering oneself temporarily invisible to a surveying power. As she says, in order to plot imaginaries that are hopeful for another way of being. In this formulation, invisibility, or as Claire Birchall, following Edouard Glissant, puts it, opacity, is in fact a site of intellectual cum social production in which actors can then reconstitute the terms of their own visibility. And working with these alternatives, I would offer, helps to avoid any straightforward moral dichotomies between privacy and surveillance, or between visibility and anonymity, because both sides of these positionalities, as we know, can be both healthy and dangerous for the people who inhabit them. Instead, it places the emphasis on visibility and invisibility as a dialectic through which political subjects are formed. In this lecture, I've sought to explore surveillance through the lens of temporality, and specifically to draw a history of surveillance as fixing, which is not only a history of circumscribing or reducing the physical mobility of certain categories of person, but in an ontological sense, the fixing of identity, the fixing of the terms through which that person becomes visible before a specific socio-political order. Privacy activists in Germany express alarm at being suspended in time, particularly through new forms of biometric surveillance, the image of their personality staying still while the future moves forward in a direction that always contains the potential to be malign. Informational self-determination communicates the possibility of having some agency over this image of their personality, or at least to understand the range of actors and interests at work around it, so as to have more control over the inevitability of change itself. But before finishing, I'd just like to return to this commonsensical association between sensibilities in Germany around privacy and data protection and the history of the Stasi. In anthropological terms, we might think of the Stasi like the pre-modern phenomenon of the scapegoat. By attaching the sins of a collective to a scapegoat and then ritually banishing them, small-scale societies were morally purified. By attaching surveillance in Germany so closely to the Stasi, binding it to the arm of a regime that no longer exists, it implicitly consigns the dangers of surveillance to the past as well. Instead, as it is clear to everyone assembled here, I'm sure, surveillance is a question of the present with profound implications for the future. The history of surveillance in Germany is not peculiar to the Stasi, but instead extends deeper into the history of censuses and census tabulation, in which both the actual machines that were used, as well as the categories through which persons were identified in these modes of mass information gathering, had substantial precedents and successors across the colonial world and its aftermath. Thinking through alternatives to the current direction of travel with regards to surveillance, I would then offer requires rethinking the settlements and contracts that were either implicitly or explicitly drawn up with the making of the modern world, and the ways in which these still determine how we all become visible. And one of the longer term goals of this project, we're a team of anthropologists attempting to think intellectually but also practically about moral or immoral surveillance, kind of the good and bad sides of monitoring, and where the line between these might lie. One of the practical goals is potentially to work with privacy activists, not just in Germany, but across the EU, to develop a universal symbolic code for rules of recording in public space. And this is broadly based on the analogical precedent of the invention of the car just over 100 years ago, and the introduction of the highway code that then becomes an easy and visual and standardized form of communication to communicate rules to drivers about the roads that they're on. And that you could potentially apply this to the universalization of recording, and introduce a similar kind of code around. So we have civil society has perhaps more agency over the rules of recording in a particular space in a more codified manner. So thank you again to the conveners for your introduction. Excuse me, I managed not to cough once, so thank you, and thank you for listening.